think that Please Don't Touch was always a much more difficult album than Voyage of the Acolyte. I mean, the first one I'd recorded when I was still in Genesis, and I had Phil and Mike as an extraordinary rhythm section who were so quick on the uptake, things just happened immediately. Nighttime sessions, everyone wanted to get in and out as quickly as possible. But yeah, they were still with me there at 3 in the morning sometimes and coming up with wonderful ideas. Once I left the band, because I realised that it was so important that new ideas did not become stillborn. Stillborn brain children don't serve music's best interest. I had to go through all of that. I wanted to work with other people. I wanted to do this kind of hybrid cross between European, British, white music and American black music, and an aspect of soul and various things. So blues, I was working with this tremendous team. If I mention some of the black performers on it, Richie Havens, wow, Randy Crawford, wow, first thing she'd had released internationally, Hoping Love Will Last. The Genesis guys, having heard that back, said, really interesting song, interesting singer, arrangement, all of that. Chester Thompson, who played brushes on it. I didn't ask him to play brushes on it, but he got the feel, that it was going to be trio meets quartet meets orchestra down the line on that. And so I think the black performers, they gave it a looseness, they gave it a spontaneity. Richie Havens, at the end of Icarus Ascending, came up with the idea of improvising over the end. For some reason, the band, whenever we rehearsed the song, we, at that time, just kept playing out on the chords over and over again. And he said, I could sing on that. So I said, why not? And it was one of those moments where I thought, I'm faking it, on this end here. It's not really written. Everyone's just grooving. Why are we doing this? And of course, the reason why is because he was to come along and sing something that was just totally liberating at the end, just freewheeling, free flying, and of course I think the same thing happened with Randy Crawford. I wrote the melody, it was very wooden. She sang it, she sounded like she was really constrained by it. So at one point, before she was about to walk out and tell me that Shirley Bassey should be singing this instead of her, I'm going to lose her any minute, I said, look, why don't you just make it your own? Sing around the melody. And then the magic started to happen, and the Randy that we all came to love and admire came out, and she virtually becomes Aretha Franklin halfway through. I didn't know that she was a huge Aretha fan. I saw a Aretha concert with her many years later where Aretha was on stage and Randy Crawford was sitting next to me. Randy Crawford is singing in my ear along to every vocal phrase. I've got 2 world-class soul singers, and it was an extraordinary thing. And then, the wonderful Chester Thompson, who I think, Chester has, stood in Phil's shadow. He's been Phil's dep, but, to be someone who can replace Phil at the drop of a hat, as well as, don't forget the pedigree that he came from Zappa, One Size Fits All, Weather Report, musicians, who is a fabulous player and a very, very sweet guy. And he recommended Tom Fowler, who was playing bass on that at the time, from the Fowler Brothers and all virtuosos. And they all gave it so much. But that album, for me, without the safety net of Genesis, I felt much more exposed. And yes, I worked with 2 of the guys from Kansas, Steve Walsh and Phil Earhart. Phil on drums, Steve Walsh's extraordinary voice, say they were all much better singers than me. I just did a little jokey vocal on it, which was Carry On Up the Vicarage. There'd been these albums in the late 60s that CBS had done. There were 2 albums, I think, called The Rock Machine Loves You, and it had tons of artists. It had Grateful Dead, Simon and Garfunkel, Tim Rose, just to mention a few. And so each track that you heard, it was like listening to a favourite radio station. They were all great tracks, whether it was the Leonard Cohen track, whatever it was. And yeah, I think the Zombies, something in there. And I thought, well, I wonder if I could do a personal sampler album that was a bit like that. In other words, you won't necessarily know that this is a guitarist's album. I'll just be the producer. I'll let things happen. I'll write it, but I'll let other people lead it and take it where they will, and let it be a very diverse thing. Now, I remember Tony Stratton Smith saying to me, maybe a year or 2 later, he said, well, its diversity was both its strength and its weakness. One could argue that diversity versus identity or versus style, you could say that, but it certainly wasn't short on content for that reason. And Stephen Wilson said to me many years later that it was, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I will. He said it was like his Sgt. Pepper. He heard it when he was about 11 years old, ears wide open, totally impressionable, and the brilliant Stephen Wilson that we know and love was influenced by it. So that's wonderful. So in a way, its time was perhaps not necessarily then, but it was, stuck in this kind of continuum, perhaps, where it was still valid, but it was yet to have full effect, later on. So there are those who regard it as a classic, and there are those who say, what the hell were you thinking? But isn't all art like that?